I'm not sure that Punxsutawney Phil is going to even come out of his hole this morning in Pennsylvania due to the weather, but we're glad that you were able to come out of yours and be with us this morning. I'm Professor Tim Demme of the College of Operational and Strategic Leadership, and I'll be your moderator for today. As we begin our second day of looking at topics in professional military ethics, I'd like to remind you that our sessions are being recorded for further distribution and use in the Naval War College programs, and that contrary to many of our events, these sessions, including your questions, are for attribution. Yesterday, we looked at the role of professional ethics in relation to military service as a profession and the nature and responsibilities of that profession. We also considered the military profession in relation to the strengths and weaknesses of recent U.S. national security policy. This morning, we'd like to continue along those same lines by first looking at some of the military technologies that are and will be used in implementing national security policy, and then by discussing the ever-present tensions between civilian control and military effectiveness. For all of our discussions today, perhaps the phrase, something old, something new, is appropriate. Our first speaker this morning is Professor George Lucas. Dr. Lucas is the class of 1984 Distinguished Chair in Ethics in the Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the United States Naval Academy, and Professor of Ethics and Public Policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. Before assuming his present responsibilities, he taught at Georgetown University, Emory University, Randolph-Macon College, the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium, and served as Philosophy Department Chairman at the University of Santa Clara in California. A graduate from the College of William and Mary, Professor Lucas received his PhD in philosophy from Northwestern University. He is the author of 5 books, more than 40 journal articles, translations and book reviews, and has also edited the 8 book-length collections of articles in philosophy and ethics. Among his titles of interest to us are Anthropologist in Arms, The Ethics of Military Anthropology, Perspectives on Humanitarian Military Intervention, Lifeboat Ethics, and The Genesis of Modern Process Thought. Dr. Lucas is also co-editor of the textbook Ethics and the Military Profession and the companion volume Case Studies in Military Ethics, and these books have been used as core courses devoted to ethical leadership at the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, and dozens of ROTC units at colleges and universities throughout the nation. Dr. Lucas has been a frequent visitor to Newport and the Naval War College, and it's a pleasure to have him back at the War College. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning. Is this on? Yes. Thank you. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I guess the simplest way of explaining my presence here is my name is George Lucas, and I'm here to talk to you about Star Wars. You have no idea how long I've waited to be able to say that. After all the jokes I've had to put up with my entire career about not being, even from my own kids, say, you're not the real George Lucas. So in that context, talking about Star Wars, I kind of wondered why Professor Cook and Professor Deming had invited me to this conference, given the other topics you're covering. I thought, well, gee, the issues that I'm talking about, R2-D2 does the global war on terror or something, that would be nothing more than an interesting diversion from these rather deep and profound and to some extent disturbing issues you've been talking about military professionalism, the future of the profession, the nature of warfare, the question of the proper mission of the United States, and so forth. But when I listened to the conversations yesterday, I kind of stumbled in mid-morning from the airport and was listening to Don Snyder and Martin talking together, as I've heard them over the years talk about this important question of the profession of arms and what the nature of a profession is and whether the military is a profession and all of this discussion, and then listening to your questions and comments afterwards. It sure sounded to me like the first one. I may have gotten this wrong because I'd just gotten here, but the first response was frustration at a bureaucratic chain of command on the part of someone who was clearly a pilot, and it sounded to me like maybe a remote pilot with his Predator lined up ready to take off, 17th in line at Kabul airport, and his CO wondering why the heck you're not in the air, you know. Now, maybe I got that wrong. But certainly there were other discussions of technology and the platforms we use and the way in which we identify ourselves or our service communities with the ships we drive or the planes we fly, and whether that really is going to work or not, and the extent to which it led to some frustrations. And then in the afternoon, Martin and Joel Rosenthal talking about Andy Bacevich's book and his vision of the question about what America's proper role is in the world and what the American warfighter's role should be in the world. Should it be the image of the constitutional history image of the state militia protecting the homeland, or is it now a kind of, well, again, a Star Wars metaphor, an empire, perhaps even an evil empire, projecting global force worldwide for whatever intentions? And so, in that sense, I suppose my first slide here, if I can get that to go, is Clausewitz. We always start with Clausewitz, the architect of our conception of conventional war, who warns us at the end of his own treatment of the war of his age that every age has its own form of warfare, and this one sort of operationalizes what might be termed Andy Bacevich's nightmare. That somehow this is not a picture of the militia protecting the homeland. This is a picture or an artist's rendition of an empire projecting force, whether a global force for good, or a global force for law and order, or a global force for security in the world order that we happen to enjoy a dominant position in, whatever it would be. That picture was not designed to be a picture of somebody's nightmare, but I'm sure Bacevich and the critics of our policy would see it as such. Actually, this picture is a good place to begin because it has an interesting provenance, an interesting set of origins. It is, the artist in question is actually a systems engineer, a colleague of Martin Cook's. Some of you may have met her, Professor Missy Cummings, up at MIT. She's a systems engineer. She runs the Human Automated Lab, HAL, talking about human-machine interfaces. And she drew this as a rendition early on in her own career after she finished serving in the Navy as an F-18 pilot. She went to work on these kinds of systems. And this will look to you, if you look at it, like perhaps a vision of Vice Admiral Cebrowski's original conception of what was at the time called net-centric warfare. We still use the term a lot. But if you stare at this, I was looking at it last night in the room. There wasn't much else to do. It was too nasty to go out. So I was looking at this and saying, you know, this is interesting in a couple of different ways. When you look at the actual platforms that are up there, where's the Predator? Where's the Reaper? Where's the Sea Scout? Swarms of them protecting the carrier. They're not in the picture. And this was only drawn a few years ago. And the things that are portrayed there, insofar as you can recognize them, a lot of them are manned platforms, piloted vehicles, many of which we either have and probably feel we don't need anymore, or never got them off the drawing board because we determined, even before we could get them designed and in production, that they were already obsolete. And we have not, as I say, then portrayed. I think down at the bottom there, those are some of the Army's future combat systems vehicles, and you know what happened to that program. And in fact, Admiral Cebrowski's whole, after he finished serving here as president of the Naval War College and went to work in the Pentagon for Secretary Rumsfeld, very quickly the specifics of his own vision were swept aside and replaced by some of the things that you all are doing now. Okay, and that's an illustration of something called Moore's Law that you've probably heard of before. Moore's Law was basically an idea that technological change starts out with the notion of how many transistors you can cram on a computer chip, and Moore observed that, well, the number we can put on there doubles every year, sort of an exponential, every 2 years. Doubles every 2 years. Now it's down to about 18 months. And that's become a metaphor for technological transformation, that things happen so quickly now that we can no longer even portray with any meaningful sort of sensibilities what it is we're up to, where we're going, let alone how we should get there. But as soon as we try to conceptualize that, come up with a roadmap or a plan, everything's obsolete, outdated, and replaced with something else. So we're constantly playing catch up with our own technology. And that's what I want to talk about today, the ethics side of this. I'm not an engineer. I come from a family of engineers, but I'm, as Tim mentioned, I'm just a lowly philosopher, philosophy professor, ethics professor. I want to look at the ethics side or challenges of some of these new technologies that you're working with now or that we believe are on the drawing board and soon should be with us as we face, in Clausewitz's sense, this new era of war in our own time, postmodern war, if you want to call it that. If Clausewitz is modern war, this is postmodern or after modern war, hybrid and small wars in which your efforts are supplemented by the help of private contractors, particularly armed private security contractors, which pose a number of dilemmas of their own, and this increasing use of technologies, robotics, non-lethal weapons, nanotechnology, all the discussion that's currently the buzz in the Navy right now about cyber war and so forth. Those are the things I'd just like to give a quick survey of this morning, and then have us have a discussion about how you see our force structure developing with all of these things accompanying the work that you do, and what impact this will have on your own notion of your service, of the Navy, of our military services as professions, and the ethical and legal challenges that some of these things will present. Last week, in talking about this out at the International Society of Military Ethics meeting in San Diego, where Missy Cummings was our keynote speaker, by the way, I came up with an analogy that seemed to me to capture the dilemma that we face in terms of thinking about the ethics side of these issues. That if Clausewitz, on this analogy, is our conception of classical warfare, how it should be fought. If you read that book, you know it's full of Newtonian metaphors about forces, vectors, competing with one another, acting on centers of gravity, moving things around. A very classical Newtonian conception. And Clausewitz is to postmodern war with its technologies and contractors and hybrid war and so forth. Clausewitz is to that very much like Newton is to contemporary physics, relativity, and quantum theory. Not irrelevant, not at all. In fact, you can't get a good understanding of quantum mechanics and relativity unless you know your Newton. I remember solving Schrodinger equations in college that the first thing you learned to do is write Newton's second law, and even if you couldn't do the problem in quantum mechanics, if you wrote F equals ma, you got 5 points. So Newton's something that you need to master. Clausewitz is something that you need to master, and yet the kind of war that we're talking about, the kind of wars that you're probably rotating in here from having deployed and fought, are not at all like the wars that Clausewitz described. They are to them as Newton's Principia was to quantum mechanics and relativity. And in the ethics case, what we have is something that people in my field work with when we think about the ethics and governance challenges of warfare. We talk about just war theory. We talk about a classical doctrine centuries in the making, discussing the reasons for going to war, the justifications for going to war, the intentions behind going to war, the extent to which we've tried to avoid it at all costs before we resort to it as a means of conflict resolution, and so forth. Just war theory is an ancient framework. It's kind of like Clausewitz and Newton. And the law of armed conflict, with which you're probably a bit more familiar, some of the details of that, law of armed conflict, all of these are sort of classical state-centered conceptions of controlled violence for the purpose of politics by other means and carrying out conflict resolution using force of arms. And what I'm arguing in this quick presentation this morning is both of them need an upgrade. The software is a bit outdated, but not completely irrelevant. It just needs to be rethought, a couple of apps downloaded perhaps and installed. The notion you're looking for to finish off this extended metaphor between Clausewitz and what you see there, packbots and Talon swords and the like, is a principle in physics you know as covariance. Covariance is searching for those principles, those laws, those relationships that remain invariant under transformation from one frame of reference to another. And that's what we want to find out now. That's what we're struggling with in my field as we try to help out on the question of new military technologies. What principles that we're used to working with will transfer into this new frame of reference? So let's start with robotics. This is an article that came out in the New York Times just a few weeks ago, really. And you see this sort of discussion all the time, that in what is otherwise a descriptive account in the New York Times of some of the new technologies and the uses we're making of them, there is this concern of critics. Critics are afraid that the technologies or the reliance on contractors or whatever it is going to make nations trigger happy, more willing and ready to go to war. A quotation here from a professor who just wrote a book at Yale University called Moral Machines, talking about ethics and robotics, that when it comes to the military side of things, wars are going to get started very easily, they'll have minimal costs, and thus nations, Wendell Wallach says, will be far too ready to resort to it. And that robotics claim turns out to be something endemic to military technologies generally. Everything that we do, every innovation we make, you'll hear a version of what I'll call in this presentation this morning the threshold problem. That somehow the threshold for going to war, for resorting to war, for using you to solve our problems is going to lower. It's going to get easier to cross because there'll be less costs associated with it. You hear this echoed in the case of robotics in an Office of Naval Research report that just came out in 2008, co-authored, among others, by a philosopher, Patrick Lynn, but also and his colleague Keith Abney. But the man in the middle, George Becky, if any of you are familiar with robotics research, this is the father of American robotics at Southern California, now retired, teaching at Cal Poly. The three of them authored this report on the ethics, the risks, the governance, the questions about design, raising the threshold problem. If we're not careful, this technology will outstrip our ability to control it, and we'll find ourselves more readily resorting to war. And of course, P.W. Singer in his book, Wired for War, that I suspect. How many of you have read Singer's book? Anybody? Okay. It's worth a read, and it's a lot of fun. It's written in a way that you'll find very engaging. And Pete, in writing this, is primarily focused on robotics, not on technology generally, though he does talk a bit about nano and non-lethal weapons and so forth. But again, he's concerned in the end, there's this feeling, I guess you'd call it. I call it moral anxiety. Moral anxiety. We just don't understand quite what we're doing, and I'm worried that we're letting, a genie out of the lamp, or Pandora's opening a box and we're going to regret what gets out. We'll never be able to put it back in. Without being very specific about, well, what are the exact concerns that you've got? And how should we respond to those? This, Pete says in his book, is, well, it's Martin's fault. It's my fault. And as people who work in our field, we don't keep up enough with this. Actually, Martin does. He's one of those people who knows a great deal about military technology. And many of us kind of look to him for encouragement in trying to stay current and stay up. But Pete Singer, in his book, Wired for War, which he's lectured on all over the world now in the last year or so, is complaining that the ethics and law people, it's always true that those things lag behind technology, but they're not doing their job. They're not on duty, and they need to wake up and get with it and help provide some guidance for the engineers and scientists, as well as military experts and policymakers who are busy trying to make sense out of all of this. There was recently, JME stands for the Journal of Military Ethics. There was a special issue of that devoted just this past December to talking about military technologies, and there that threshold problem is raised by several of the authors in that issue as well. So that's one set of concerns, the threshold problem. The other big one that I think is relevant to you folks and what you're doing in this ethics symposium this week is the one we were talking about yesterday, military professionalism. If robots, if private contractors can do it better, faster, and cheaper, which originally was a NASA mantra for the space program, and became the watchword of the Military Contracting Association. We can do it better, faster, cheaper. We'll do what? Run the dining facility? Got it. Clean the latrines? With you. Fight your nation's wars for you? Maybe not. But better, faster, cheaper. If we can do it using contractors and robots, what does that say about the issue you were discussing yesterday? Where does that leave military professionalism, if that's true? And if it's false, what is this thing that Don and Martin were talking about called jurisdiction? Where is the jurisdiction? Where are the lines to be drawn that define the activities that only you, as experts, as custodians of special skills and knowledge, should be allowed to go, and where, at best, we use contractors, robots, and other things to assist you, but not to take your place? If robots and contractors could do it better, faster, cheaper, what becomes of the Center for Army Professional Ethics, CAPE? The program that you may have heard about, and certainly Don Snyder was instrumental in getting that started. What's the point of all that if we're going to replace everybody and everything with the vision you saw in that picture a little while ago? And Admiral Mike Mullen convened a bunch of us at the National Defense University just early last month, and talking about his concerns about military professionalism. How does that concern about the future of the military fit in with these developments? It seems to me we haven't thought this through clearly at all. So if we looked at some of the issues that come up with specifically unmanned vehicles, ground, air, maritime vehicles, underwater vehicles, by far these have gotten the most attention. That's the stuff that captures everybody's imagination. It is R2-D2. We all like to think about that. And so insofar as people have kept up with this, the robotics issue has probably emerged as the most centrally featured one. And robotics is, the engineers would tell you, we look for the jobs that are dull, dirty, and dangerous, like hunting down IEDs or exploring caves to see who's down there if the bad guys are hiding there. It's much better to use a robot for something like that than to use a human being. They can do those jobs just as effectively. Those are dull jobs, those are dirty jobs, those are dangerous jobs. What we need, however, when we turn to talking about ethics in robotics is something that I think is lacking in the conversation. There's a lot of hype, there's a lot of hysteria. People in my field, in ethics, tend to get portrayed by the engineers as the people who are getting in the way, telling us we can't do what we otherwise know we can do and what many of us feel we should do. The ethics guys are the ones who come in talking about killer robots and visions of a future of a kind of Armageddon of machines taking over and committing war crimes and atrocities and so forth. They're ignorant, They don't know the technology. They're fear-mongering, naysaying Luddites who just cause a lot of trouble. What I'd like to urge instead is that we sort of work together, engineers and ethicists and military professionals, to try and say, where are we going? What is it we're trying to accomplish? And are there better and worse pathways by which we can achieve the objectives of national security and a stable global order under the rule of law, where people can live safely and pursue happiness in their own way? And if robotics is part of that equation, then we need to think about the way in which this is going to work. From my side, the hysteria sometimes comes from the science side, from the engineering side. We have at the Naval Postgraduate School a parade of people coming through from time to time, like this individual, a very well-respected, one of the world leaders, I think, in autonomous robotic platforms. And look at there's a lot on that slide, no need to read it all. It's just that he makes 3 points. He first makes the Moore's Law point, that this is really moving along quickly. It took us 12 years, he says, to fly our first 250,000 unmanned or remotely piloted hours. And it's only taken 6 months to get the second 250,000 hours in. So that's certainly an exponential function. And he cites the overriding reason that everybody cites for doing this. We got to save money. We don't have, as Basovich worried, we don't have the resources to carry out our mission, just continuing along extrapolating along the ways we've been doing it heretofore. We need to figure out how to do it better, faster, and cheaper. And then the third point. In order to do this, we now need to get rid of that commanding officer and indeed that frustrated pilot waiting 17th in line to take off in Kabul, and we need to use more autonomy. We need to marry autonomy with our unmanned platforms so that they can carry out these functions without a human either in the loop or on the loop. That's where we're going. And so you get that kind of cheerleading for these kinds of developments in things like the unmanned systems roadmaps that the Navy, the Air Force, and so forth have. And you'll just see this. This is coming. It's going to happen. We're doing it. We can do it. We must do it. Any questions? Moving along in that trajectory, almost without stopping to reflect on, well, how feasible is this and how desirable are some of these innovations? Are some better than others? Have we stopped to think which way we might want to have this roadmap actualized or have it carried out and developed? Okay, let's see. Okay, here, then, by contrast, are the naysaying Luddites, the fearmongers who object to this. Missy Cummings, who's an engineer and is busy working in these areas, is in the center there. She was our keynote speaker, as I said last week, at the Military Ethics Conference, and she is hardly a Luddite, quite the contrary. Very knowledgeable systems engineer, but someone who advocates more human-machine interface as the best way to go, that the autonomy thing, at least the unsupervised autonomy, is probably not as desirable a development or as achievable a development as learning how to provide executive oversight of swarms. He does robotic swarms, if you've heard that phrase, and is brilliant in trying to figure out how the controller back in the Predator control area is able to work with all these different screens and computer boards and so forth. Can we find a better way of developing command and control of our unmanned or remotely piloted systems rather than trying to just get rid of the person in the booth? Up to her left is a colleague of hers from England who is very critical of America's trajectory in these roadmaps at present, particularly with regard to autonomy and lethal force. He is a roboticist by the name of Noel Sharkey, and he is the co-founder of a group called the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. Down at the right is Pete Singer, whose book I mentioned and commend to you and suggest you read if you haven't. And up in the right-hand corner, well, as you can probably judge from his appearance, that is one of my people. He's a philosopher, an Australian philosopher by the name of Rob Sparrow, who wrote an article in 2007 called Killer Robots, arguing in essence that the work that we're doing right now at my institution, at the Naval Postgraduate School, and at other places around the country, is a violation of international law. Why? Because autonomous platforms armed with lethal force cannot really meaningfully be controlled by human beings. They're likely to do things, they're likely to make mistakes, make errors, or run amok. And if they do, there's no way of meaningfully holding them accountable. And under international law, Rob argues, you cannot build a weapons system. You cannot even do the development side, let alone the production, manufacture, and deployment of systems, weapons systems, for which meaningful accountability under law is impossible to achieve. So that's one objection. And I've put in parentheses up there, we've heard this before, this legal argument about accountability. And where we heard it is not with robots, but with military contracting. Remember, that was the problem that came to the forefront finally in the so-called Nisour Square incident in 2007, when the Blackwater Guards for the State Department opened fire in Nisour Square in Baghdad, and 17 Iraqis were killed or wounded. You know that people in uniform, if that had happened, there would have been immediately detention and court-martial. And some finding would have been issued, and if anybody had engaged in wrongdoing, they would have been appropriately punished under the law. We have in the military a very strict system. Some find it perhaps unfairly strict, but we have a very clear line of accountability under the law for the behavior of men and women in uniform. We had nothing like this for contractors, and now Rob's arguing we've got nothing like it for robots. How's this going to work? So you may recall that the Nisour Square Five were finally indicted and tried under something called the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, which is a very complicated legal regime and doesn't really clearly apply to this case. And in the end, it could not be made to fit, and the judge ended up, dismissing all the charges. There was no evidence. There was no way of custody of the evidence that would be required for a criminal trial in the states and so forth. So it was a mess. Well, we sort of tried to fix that up with contractors. What are we going to do about robots? That's Rob Sparrow's problem. Pete Singer describes something he calls the precautionary principle. And at the end of his book, he suggests that the pace at which we're going with robot development, what we need to do is remember what the biomedical scientists did back in the early days of the human genome research, when they had the similar kinds of fears that we do about robotics now. Concerns better than fears. They stopped, they paused, they waited, they took a deep breath, and they collectively got together and said, look, are we sure we know what we're doing here? Can we think it out a bit more carefully, decide whether there are avenues of research and development that we might not want to go down or go down quickly without proper supervision, and others where we got basically a green light or at most a yellow. And so they stopped and did that in the 1980s with human genome research, which is by and large going pretty well. Subsequently, why couldn't, Pete concludes his book suggesting, why couldn't we do that with robotics? Have we had that kind of conversation yet? And then there are issues that you've probably heard mentioned from other quarters about whether we're going to develop some kind of a PlayStation mentality or a video game mentality with the use of robots and remotely piloted and controlled platforms and so forth. Actually, the problem has been sort of the opposite. When the real data start coming in as opposed to the concerned, fearful speculations, it seems that what happens is the operator or the predator can see very clearly, unlike a pilot of a B-2 at 30,000 feet, that predator pilot can see exactly what his target is and what happens when he hits it. And sometimes that's a little jarring when especially if there's been collateral damage and then you go home to your family, and have Thanksgiving dinner after a day at the office. So there's been an unusual kind of traumatic stress associated with this that nobody anticipated. They thought people would think it was, I think Singer quotes in his book, effing cool, is what some pilots say about running flying their predators. But that hasn't been the case. It hasn't been as detached as all that. Other kinds of concerns. Yesterday, an interesting phrase came up. It was equivocation. Something about, I think, our discussion of the mission of American military power and the Basovich case, that I think Martin Cook used the phrase equivocation, meaning that one word will have several different meanings. Certainly Don Snyder referred to this. They'll talk past each other, and they'll use profession and professionalism to mean different things and never realize even what it is that the parties in the conversation are talking about. And boy, robotics is really subject to that kind of a problem. People equivocate all the time. The terms of the debate change and shift, and it's very important to try and nail things down and talk about one subject at a time. For example, autonomy. If this is a goal, it isn't it isn't the sort of thing that we mean when we talk about self-governance, of deciding, who to marry or what to get our spouse for Valentine's Day or something. It really is just problem solving, encountering unforeseen obstacles and being able to respond to them appropriately. I have at home a Roomba, an iRobot vacuum machine. How many of you have Roombas in your house, just out of curiosity? Again, anybody? Again, not very many. If you could afford one for Valentine's Day, get that rather than one of the conflict diamonds for your spouse. I got a Roomba for my wife, and she says now, honey, I love you, but I think I love Alfred more. She's named him, after Batman's butler. Don't worry about a thing, Mom. I'll just come in and tidy up a bit, be on my way. The robot comes buzzing through, and if it encounters obstacles, chairs and electric cords and stuff, it can figure out how to untangle itself, and if it can, it knows to stop before it destroys itself or injures itself, and it issues a little cry, kind of whining in the corner like a kid until you come and find it and help it out. It can learn where objects are in the room. If you leave it alone, it will actually memorize the structure of the room and the placement of furniture and do a consistently better job. It knows where it lives, has a little home that it goes and backs into and charges up. And you can set it on kind of an automatic pilot. It'll come on in the middle of the night and vacuum for you and be all done by the time you wake up in the morning. It's really a nifty device. Makes husbands obsolete. So autonomy is something like that. Autonomy is problem solving. And as Noel Sharkey says, it's really nothing other than the kind of programming language you learned way back when. There may be all kinds of sophisticated variations and subroutines and so forth, but it's if this, then that. If an obstacle, go left, or then go right. Or if an electric cord, well, it won't know that, but if there's some obstacle that's tangled up inside, it knows what to do. And in the case of military robotics, what we've done is say we can go from a very carefully scripted form of autonomy, like in a cruise missile where you set the target, and you point, fire, and forget. And it knows how to figure out how to get where it needs to go and undertake evasive action if need be, to something that Missy Cummings and her folks at HAL are working on, scripted, supervised, executive oversight of swarms of intelligent systems, to something a bit more troubling that the people like Rob Sparrow and critics of robotics are worried about: strong artificial intelligence, where the programs not only execute what you tell them to do, not only learn about their environment and learn to do it better, but are capable of changing the overall outcome, that is, changing the mission. My robot at home, no matter what obstacles it encounters and what it learns about my house, good or bad, in the end, it just vacuums the floor. It doesn't decide to repel intruders with lethal force on its own. And strong AI has that capacity. So that's really where the problem is when you marry autonomy in the strong AI sense with lethal force. That's when we have trouble. Fortunately, we haven't done that yet. And probably, if Professor Cummings is right, it's not something that we're likely to do in the foreseeable future. She argues that the capacity for doing this. We just don't have it yet. We don't have the ability to discriminate reliably. We don't have character recognition software that would be able to tell something between, say, a child and a soldier, or between a combatant and a non-combatant. And until we get those kinds of things worked out, we're not going to have any autonomy that's troubling in an ethical, legal, or moral sense. If we did go that direction, the critics like Noel Sharkey have said, well, look, you have these, back to our classical just war theory and international law, we have these constraints that you all operate under, the principle of distinction, as it's called in international law, or discrimination, as it's called in just war theory, that you don't ever deliberately target non-combatants, and you do your best to avoid doing any damage to them. That's the second principle of proportionality there. And all people on deployment know about this and are required to adhere to those standards. We don't know how to build a robot yet that would be able to do that. So on the positive side, people worried about ethics have said, before we naysay robotics and gerrymander it out of existence, bear in mind that some of these things might be not only solvable problems, but desirable problems to solve. Why? Because, of course, the combat arena is a very dangerous place to be. Human beings get angry, they get scared, they try to get even. Most war crimes are committed by people who are either terrified or outraged at injuries done to their comrades and take it out inappropriately on bystanders. Robots don't do that. They don't get scared. They don't feel anything at all. They do what they're told, or they'll do what we tell them to do. So engineer and roboticist Ron Arkin at Georgia Tech has argued we have a moral obligation to try and develop as much autonomy married with lethal force as we can under certain circumstances, and we will have gotten the desirable behavior that we seek when a robot can perform in a field of combat as well or better than a human being can with regard to adherence to the laws of war. This, I think, brings up something interesting, and I want to kind of keep this, I want to save time for us to have some conversation about this, but I think this is the fascinating piece of this debate about military technology. If you look in the past at the way in which the arguments have proceeded, it's always been from the catapult to the longbow to the crossbow to gunpowder to the long rifle, etc., to cannons and nuclear war and whatever. The technology, the trajectory has been more and more destruction, more and more indiscriminate destruction visited upon a wider range of the human population. Now, our colleagues, my colleagues in robotics, are suggesting for the first time what we can offer you is technology that offers greater precision, greater adherence to the law, less destruction, and more discrimination. And I think that deserves to be heard very carefully. In the hysteria surrounding robotics, is this true? Or is this a likely prospect? If so, it's a very happy one. It's a useful one. It's a hopeful one. War has always been something that we have regretted deeply because of its indiscriminate destructiveness. If we're now talking about conducting it in a way that lowers all of that, lessens it, that would be a good thing, not a bad thing. So that's the positive side if you talk about ethics prospects as opposed to obstacles. Okay, so that's the end of robotics, and as I say, that's the leading edge of the discussion. So let me just quickly survey some issues that come up in other areas, and then we'll do the Q&A. Warrior enhancements, biological, physical enhancements, pharmaceutical enhancements. DARPA's got plans on the board for folks like yourself who will be able to subsist in the battlefield by eating grass, not need any sleep, and be able to climb walls like Spider-Man, okay? I mean, this is on the boards. These kinds of things are discussed. That's the sort of stuff, and I've called it the Iron Man phenomenon, for those of you who are fans of that comic book and movie. And some interesting, suppose any of that is feasible, how desirable is it? What problems would it present? If we enhanced warfighters to enable them to eat grass and do without sleep, is that something we want them to go through the rest of their lives being able to do? Is that going to have some impact on the way in which they live those lives that would be detrimental to their humanity and to their pursuit of happiness after they ceased wearing a uniform and serving their country? If so, let's be a little careful about the enthusiasm with which we pursue those avenues of development. Could somebody who was wearing a uniform object on moral or religious grounds to being enhanced if there were particular useful things that we could do to use surgically, or pills that you could take that would increase your capacity in the battlefield? Would you have reason to object to that on religious grounds or other grounds, and should we respect that or not? How safe ought these technologies to be? How much reassurance should we be able to provide you that we're not altering your life beyond our capacity or yours to understand or recover from before we actually use and deploy these things? Those are among some of the legal and ethical considerations. And then yesterday's topic of civil-military relations, that comes up as well. Because what's going to happen when these enhancements, notice how quickly military technologies have a kind of blowback into the civilian world and end up being much more influential there often than they were initially in the military. GPS and whatever else you want, the internet, Al Gore's internet. All of this stuff has had tremendous impact in the civilian world. What will the impact be of these kinds of things alongside robotics if civilians get a hold of them, whatever they may be? If civilians start being able to eat grass and go without sleep and climb walls like Spider-Man, is that a good thing? Is that something we want? How carefully can we guard or protect the technology from proliferation if we don't want it to proliferate? So what happens in the social world and the civilian world when these applications have dual uses and so forth? Those are among the questions that I think a reasonable person would ask about these kinds of technologies, and we need to ask them, and then we need to think about them, we need to work on them. Non-lethal weapons is another area. That's the Army's active denial system. I'm sure you've all seen the YouTube photos of this thing at work and the volunteers kind of getting out of the way of the ray, and it would be used to break up and disperse crowds in an awkward situation, and other kinds of uses as well. The use to which some of these technologies would be put hasn't altogether clearly been worked through, and it needs to be. But there are underlying considerations that come out of what turn out to be classical just war theory and international law that we would want to ask about these. For example, with non-lethal weapons, so-called non-lethal weapons, are the rules of engagement going to remain the same? That is, I restrain myself from using force until all the other options have been exhausted, and then I use non-lethal force? Or will it be the case that because the force I can use is non-lethal, I'll be tempted to resort to it more frequently? In a case where I wouldn't use a gun, a pistol, or a cannon, I'll use an active denial system. Which of those ways will it go? Well, we don't know in the military case because we haven't really tried it very much, but we do know in the civilian world, and again, go to YouTube and see some of the really interesting, you'll find them amusing until you think about them. I can't keep myself from laughing when I see how the police use tasers, like on a 79-year-old grandmother who's mouthing off for a traffic ticket, and she gets tasered. That's a YouTube video you can see. And this is Texas, and I'm a Texan, and my view is, well, they probably deserve it, but it isn't harmless. Tasers are very painful, and of course, if they cause the individual to fall, and somebody's elderly like that, they could, break a bone, they could smash their skull, they could have a heart attack. So the indiscriminate use of these weapons, as though they are nothing because they're non-lethal, can have untoward consequences. We haven't worked out rules of engagement very, very carefully. And of course, the main principle that you're familiar with in the law of armed conflict is you can't deliberately target civilians. But that active denial system is designed to target civilians, and pepper spray and so forth. You remember the Moscow theater incident in Russia a few years ago. Everyone in the theater, hostages and Chechens, were all gassed first, and some of the people died, including hostages, just from that experience, so it wasn't non-lethal. But it was intended that everybody die, and then the security forces could go in and pick out the Chechens and put them to death and save the rest of the hostages. That would not be a legal, under current international law, we couldn't do that in a military setting. Crowd control in that way and just targeting everybody is not a viable option, and yet this is one of the things that is contemplated with non-lethal weapons. So they raise some interesting and challenging issues. And then I think everybody's on board. The Navy has certainly taken this with 10th Fleet Cyber Command and so forth. And here's some of the reasons why cyber war has enjoyed such fascination and fear and concern in military circles. There's a comparative slide of the energies involved in various kinetic activities. One is the conventional tactical nuclear weapon of the Hiroshima variety, and you see that the destruction of the Glen Canyon and/or the Hoover dams would, by comparison, unleash energy from 800 to 1,200 times greater than a tactical nuclear weapon, and that's something that could be done with a cyber attack. So that's what people are fearful of, to get back here. And would such an attack by an adversary that had that kind of destructive consequences, would that be considered, as it would in a kinetic case, a cause for war? And would we respond in kind with another cyber attack or with a conventional military attack? Cyber weapons, it turns out, and I'm going rather quickly here because I want to wrap it up, but cyber weapons generally are designed, a colleague of mine at the Postgraduate School has pointed out, to target civilians. Again, it is the general population that's affected by denial of services, water, electricity, financial chaos, whatever it might be. And again, that's a violation of international law to deliberately target civilians, and yet we do it. My theory about why that's happening without much reflection at present in our own development of cyber weapons and tactics is that the people who are involved in doing this are actually not you guys and gals. They're not people who are part of the military profession and thus have these kind of traditional constraints as part of the code of the warrior, as well as just war theory and international law by which they abide, but people who work in the field of intelligence and espionage. That is, they've generalized beyond the kind of intelligence work and covert actions that they normally undertake, which aren't governed by such laws and rules and traditions, and now are taking the lead in developing cyber weapons and tactics and our strategy for cyber war. And I think that bears some careful observation and discussion and reflection. I don't think anybody's really thought about that. Yeah, it's the intelligence guys running the show now, not the warfighters. So my final comment then is that this discussion, this quick survey of emerging military technologies and the ethical and legal challenges they represent suggests that after all, the jus ad bellum and jus in bello, jab and jib, concepts, those classical Clausewitzian-like concepts from just war theory, are not irrelevant. They've just been transformed into a new context. We still have to ask questions about whether we have the right to do the things that we do, whether our intentions are justifiable, whether we've taken every precaution to avoid resorting to war, whether carried out by us or by robots or with cyber weapons and tactics. Likewise, when we do engage, we have to do our best not to target civilians and to keep the damage done to a minimum in proportion with the military objectives and overall mission. So those are new challenges, but there's no need to abandon the kind of traditional way we think about these things. We've got the conceptual equipment to do this work. We need to get on with the business of doing it. Martin mentioned yesterday that I'd say something about one of these principles, and I think it's an area that we need to think about especially carefully. It is the threshold problem. It is the last resort problem. Traditionally, war has been resorted to as a last resort. Why? Is it because of the tremendous destructiveness of war? That generally is the reason given, a kind of utilitarian consideration. War, we've discovered through terrible experience over the course of human history, is such a bad thing that you ought to do everything else first before you resort to violence to settle your conflicts. But notice, I pointed out earlier in the presentation that the technologies we're talking about here, they have the prospect, whether cyber or robots or whatever, of being much more discriminate and much less destructive. Think of the folks who in Kosovo who hit dual-use targets with conventional kinetic weapons and then had to worry about how we're going to build the bridges and power plants and dams and so forth back afterwards, and all the suffering and trauma that caused, versus a denial of service in a cyber attack where once the conflict's over, you just give the adversary the password in exchange for resolving whatever caused the conflict in the first place. Everything's back online. Your retirement fund is once again accessible to you. It hasn't really gone anywhere. It's a heck of a lot easier to restore things denied in a cyber attack than in a conventional one. So is there any reason to think that war ought to be a last resort for conflict resolution if other resorts are more destructive? Sanctions and trade embargoes and the things like that visit real physical suffering on human beings. Is it possible that the principle of last resort needs to be rethought in this context? There have always been sort of considerations of this in the history of just war theory. I think the technologies raise that perspective for us once again. Anyway, that's the survey of the issues. And here are a couple of references of groups that are working on them. Our cruiser group I mentioned already at the Postgraduate School with regard to unmanned systems and robots, education and research. And CETMONS, the Consortium for Emerging Technologies, National Security, and Military Operations and National Security, a consortium of a number of schools and colleagues in engineering, science, ethics, law, philosophy, all working on these things together. You can visit them or us at www.cetmons.org and get some resources for your own reflection on these issues. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you very much. You've given us much to think about, and it's a large umbrella with a lot of things under it. And at this time, we'd like to have a few minutes for questions, please.
Whoops. Can we have the slides back up for a minute? This? Okay. Questions?
Any questions?
Yes, Professor.
Sir Jim Ellsworth, Naval War College faculty. I'm really surprised by your conclusion, given where you started out, and I'd like to challenge that by asking your reaction to what I would call the central paradox of military technologies, which is that because war's fundamental nature is about the use of violence to achieve your policy objectives, about causing your adversaries, decision makers, enough pain that they'll quit. There's your Clausewitz. The more that we are able to use technologies to take our warfighter out of reach of the adversary, the more we literally compel them, force them to target our non-combatants so that they can have the ability to use violence to pursue their policy objectives. And that, I would say, is the central ethical dilemma that these technologies raise, and one that absolutely requires the presence of the profession of arms and the ethical leadership of us, the military professionals, to address. Not to say that we shouldn't do these things, certainly, because we have an ethical obligation to protect our warfighters, but only that it absolutely requires our careful consideration, reflection, and ethical strategic leadership to reach the right balance.
Thank you. It was a great question. Were you referring, when you said my remarks at the end, to the last resort question or to the cyber war stuff specifically?
To the last resort piece,
okay.
yes.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more in the end. In fact, that's kind of what I'm advocating, that I want this conversation back in the box and under control of men and women who wear the uniform, who come from the profession, whose job it is to think about when and how force ought to be deployed to resolve conflict. I'm not happy with this residing in the hands of engineers. I wrote an article last summer called Nerds Gone Wild, talking about the sense in which, you know, guys and gals who work in this area can be very unreflective about these kinds of questions. Not that the answers are all bad, but they don't even want to, you know, oh, that's not my job, I don't do that. Well, whose job is it? In the end, it's your job, and you know more about that job, and therefore we want to have that conversation, include you, and perhaps be guided by your reflections from your own professional experience. As to the last resort thing generally, I'm not suddenly advocating that war would be a better alternative than other kinds of modes of conflict resolution, only that the technologies pose this question for us. I started by saying everyone's worried about the threshold problem, and concluded by saying maybe we should look at the threshold and wonder who made that rule, what is it we're trying to accomplish with that rule, that war should be resorted to only as a last, as a final option. Why do we believe that to be true, and do we have good grounds for continuing to believe that to be true? That's the kind of, merely a question, I think, that's properly posed by this. One to which I have some provisional answers that I won't bore you with, but I think that we need to have that discussion.
Absolutely. As an intelligence professional, though, I would just encourage us to think about the threshold problem from the adversary's perspective as well.
Right. Good. Yes?
Sir Major Dan Hendricks, the adversary problem actually was a perfect segue for me. Probably spoken partly from ignorance in terms of robotics, but two questions, or a two-part question on the adversary problem. One is, I'm assuming that to deal with the proportionality discrimination problem, it will take some sort of algorithm to keep robotics from attacking civilians. Looking from the adversary side, wouldn't that just enable them to use that as a defense, to cloak themselves as civilians, as terrorists and other enemies often do? And then also with the diffusion of technology, when that technology they develop gets into someone else's hands, which it will, what happens when they strip it of those algorithms and turn it back against us?
Right, both very good questions. And a lot of the conversation at present is as with conventional war, is driven by the fact that we sort of control the battle space. We control the airspace, the battle space. With our technologies, we're far out ahead of anybody else in robotics and even in cyber weapons, as the Chinese keep gritting their teeth and reminding us, it's you guys, you know, we're worried about you. Why are you worried about us? But of course, they have resorted to cyber attacks on our infrastructure, or at least to covert cyber operations, on the grounds that our conventional forces are so vastly superior to their own that there's no point in trying to adjudicate the conflicts between us by going that route. So there is there are a myriad of issues here that are worth discussing from the standpoint of the adversary. First is the paradox of precision, the sense in which once we get superiority in a technology, just as with conventional forces, we find that adversaries recognizing that aren't going to come out on the battlefield and fight with us. Aren't going to, you know, after Gulf I, nobody was going to fight the American military again in a conventional war, so they adopt terrorist tactics and insurgencies and IEDs and suicide bombers. You put robots out there armed with a proportionality algorithm, the enemy doesn't have them or can't match yours. So they're either going to steal them and re-engineer them, reverse engineer them, to come after you in ways that take advantage of your adherence to principles of law and justice in the just war theory, or they're going to find some other way of carrying out combat altogether. We'll leave the battlefield and we'll bring the conflict back home to the civilian population that's deployed these weapons to the far corners of the earth. All of that does need to be thought out rather carefully. My going in position is, just as today we have these conversations about what happens when your adversaries don't obey the laws and have no regard for the rules, this is a problem. But it doesn't mean that we behave like they and sink to their level. It doesn't really give us any advantage. In a sense, it causes them to win the war of hearts and minds if we do that. So we're going to face similar kinds of dilemmas of asymmetry with regard to respect for the rule of law, I think, and for ethics in these new technologies as we do now in conventional and irregular warfare. And we just need to keep that in mind and keep thinking creatively about what to do about it. Proliferation of the weapons, particularly robotics, is one of the things I think the more otherwise hysterical critics have a point about. Are you going to be able to deploy these things and then keep them from falling into enemy hands and being used against you? If you can't, don't put them out there until you're pretty sure you can. Doesn't seem to be an insolvable problem. Yes, other questions? Yes?
Tech Commander Byrd, I'd like to make the argument that these weapons are already starting to find their ways into the hands of third state actors. One example is during the Israel war with Lebanon, Hezbollah had gotten themselves hold of modern anti-ship cruise missiles and attempted to use them against an Israeli warship. The net effect with that was they actually ended up sinking a merchant ship because while we have kind of procedures to use these and ensure that they hit where they're supposed to, Hezbollah just pointed and fired and ended up sinking a merchant ship.
Right. Right. So yeah, what often happens is when they fall into the wrong hands, the adversary doesn't know how to use them or properly, and they end up indiscriminately doing a lot of collateral damage. Again, just another problem with proliferation. Is that a reason against developing some of these systems? Because in the end, they'll find their way into the enemy's hands and be misused in this way. Is there something we can do when we do the precautionary thing of thinking this out here and now to prevent that from happening? Automatic disarmament or codes or something that prevent the weapons being used at all. Seems, as I said a minute ago, it's not an insolvable problem, and we know this will happen, so what are we going to do to prevent it? That's part of the engineering design from the get-go, if you care about such things, and we should. I saw another hand. Yes? Okay.
Now, in regards to the accountability factor, it seems to me you would always have a commander, a military commander, employing these weapons. And so the fact that they're autonomous in nature doesn't remove that from the equation, and maybe makes the decision to pull the trigger earlier in the kill chain.
Right.
So I'd like to get your thoughts on this.
Okay. There is, again, this is a phrase borrowed from Professor Cummings at MIT, an automation bias that seems to creep in. The first example we had of this was in 1987 in the USS Vincennes disaster when an Aegis missile system shot down an Iranian airliner. And of course, there were plenty of humans in and on that executive loop exercising presumably oversight. But the after-action investigation and report of that, which was actually conducted by my co-author in that ethics textbook, Captain Rick Rubel, who was a ship designer, a naval architect, conducted the discussion and discovered that there had been this reluctance on the part of the humans to intervene in the kill chain. Once it was, they trusted, in the end, in a way that I don't find surprising, they trusted their instrument readings rather than their own intuitions that this didn't just look right. There were other issues about command climate and the commanding officer and so forth, but that, I think, initially, the blame was placed perhaps unfairly on the command climate, and it turned out to be this phenomenon instead, that, you know, just as when you're learning to fly, they have to teach you to trust your instruments and not your instincts, or you're going to end up upside down in the water. Why shouldn't we have the same kind of thing with the instrument readings in automated autonomous systems or semi-autonomous systems? However, in that case, the intuitions of the human being in the executive loop, we wanted those exercised. Well, when do we turn that on and when do we turn that off? Pilots know when to trust their instincts and when to say, keep my eye on the altimeter and my instruments and not worry about what's going on outside or I'm going to get confused. That automation bias in the case of autonomous systems or semi-autonomous systems is problematic. And we don't really have a good answer for that yet. And I think you're right. It's an extension of a problem that we've wrestled with for generations. We can think it out, but we don't have answers to it, and we need to do a better job. Did that answer the question, or at least address it? Okay, anything else? Yes, ma'am.
What's the role of modeling, simulation, and testing out some of these concepts?
What's the role of modeling and testing out? I think, in a way that question's out of my jurisdiction and over my pay grade because I don't do that kind of thing. The philosophy ethics people sort of, in a way, our job is, I think, more like that of a marriage counselor or a therapist or something. We listen to people who are struggling with problems and try to develop a framework in which they can interpret them, understand them more clearly, and then reach solutions on their own. So in that sense, it seems to me we do wargaming all the time. We do simulations for all kinds of things. Some humorous anecdotes on that in that score were discussed yesterday when somebody suggested in a war game scenario, well, maybe we shouldn't fight the war, we should go into the diplomatic solution. And suddenly the scenario grinds to a halt because that wasn't one of the assumptions built into the game. But we need to game these things, I think, and we need to try and sort of see what happens if we were to deploy a mixed force. What kind of force mix would you like? What kind of force mix would you like to test with regard to the use of robots, contractors, and military professionals? What kind of supervision of the first two would you have in the latter case? Game that out, see how it works. And probably it wouldn't be a bad idea to have some people that normally aren't at the table, like Martin, involved in those conversations to help the people interpret the results that they're getting. But certainly, the scenarios need to be looked at, and we really haven't done that with regard to the ethics questions.
Thank you very much, George.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time.
Thanks. Great to be here.
We'll take a break now until 10:15 and return in 10:15. Thank you.